In just 6 brief minutes, a 24-year-old radio operator made a decision even his own commander didn't dare to make. That decision unfolded in freezing winds, distant artillery blasts, and dense radio static, all inside the tightening noose around Bastogne. A choice that seemed impossible ended up saving more than 700 men, preventing a massacre that would have erupted only minutes later. The winter of 1944 covered the Ardennes forest in a thick, merciless layer of snow, cutting off nearly every supply route into Bastogne. Frost clung to steel helmets, breaths turned to white mist, reminding every soldier that death lurked quietly around them. The 502nd Regiment of the 101st Airborne had been surrounded for days, out of contact, low on supplies, and dangerously short on ammunition. Inside ice-crusted trenches, the paratroopers tried to stay warm with thin jackets, clinging to hope for a miracle that might never come. Among the hundreds of exhausted faces stood one easily overlooked man, PFC. Ralph Radio Lance, the battalion's young radio operator. Lance spoke little, was disciplined, and stayed at his radio for hours, even when others collapsed into sleep from cold and exhaustion. He understood that in a tightening siege, the radio was the battalion's last lifeline to the outside world. Through layers of crushing static, Lance patiently swept frequency after frequency, searching for any signal that might help them survive. Every tiny adjustment mattered, because even a brief flash of clarity could be enough to save the entire unit. Then, suddenly, a strange signal appeared, not German, yet not from any nearby American unit either. The muffled voice sounded like American artillery from far behind the lines, squeezed through layers of interference like a cry buried in electrical storms. They were reading back the coordinates for their opening barrage, distorted words, but the critical parts were unmistakable. When Lance caught the final numbers clearly, a chill ran down his spine. The coordinates matched the exact position of the 502nd. Such an error would erase the entire battalion from the map of Bastogne in mere minutes. Lance shot upright, bolting out of the snow bunker with a terror only he had witnessed through the radio signal. Wind screamed through the Ardennes. Artillery rumbled in the distance, urging him to run faster before it was too late. Lance slipped on the ice but pushed himself up instantly, refusing to lose even a single precious second. Inside the command bunker, a weak yellow lamp lit the tense faces leaning over the battle map. When Lance burst inside, the commander looked up in confusion, unsure what could terrify the young operator so badly. Lance reported the strange signal and the artillery coordinates, his voice still trembling from fear and cold. At first, the commander doubted him. American artillery hitting its own troops was extremely rare, almost unthinkable. But when Lance repeated each number, the commander bent over the map, compared the markings, and froze in horror. The red grid lines showed the coordinates landing directly in the middle of the 502nd's defensive line, where nearly 700 men were holding on. The bunker's air grew heavy. No one spoke. Only the cold wind hissed through the cracks in the old wooden door. If that barrage landed, the entire battalion would be wiped out within minutes, without ever understanding what hit them. The commander turned to Lance with a grave expression, fully aware of the catastrophe looming if they didn't act immediately. He ordered an urgent verification of the signal before the artillery opened its first volley and turned Bastogne into a death trap. Lance spun the dial again, but the signal had vanished. German jamming was intensifying, drowning the radio in white noise like screaming wind. Outside, the snow thickened, making long-range communication unstable, reduced to faint, fragile breaths of sound. Lance knew that if he couldn't recover that signal within the next few minutes, the 502nd would not survive until morning. Lance kept turning through each frequency band, hoping the artillery signal would return even for just a few brief seconds. The static was thick like wind tearing through metal, swallowing every attempt to make a stable connection. The commander stood behind Lance, silently watching every small movement, knowing each second now carried enormous weight. The Bastogne map lay open before them, red lines showing the German encirclement tightening by the hour. On the outer line, soldiers reported strange sounds in the forest signs that German forces were repositioning. They knew the next attack could come at any moment, especially as the worsening weather crippled their defenses. Lance pressed the headphones tighter, his ears aching from the static, trying to detect a familiar pattern of sound. A weak burst of radio signal flickered through, vanishing instantly before he could identify its source. The commander checked his watch. If the artillery fired on schedule, they had less than 10 minutes to stop the disaster. Lance gripped the microphone, reminding himself that the entire battalion was depending on his trembling hands. German artillery boomed in the distance, signaling they were testing fire on suspected American positions. The blasts echoed into the command bunker, heightening the pressure and reminding everyone how little time remained. A soldier rushed in, reporting that visibility in the trenches had dropped to nearly zero as the snowfall intensified. The commander nodded, knowing this would make spotting friendly fire mistakes nearly impossible unless they acted quickly. Lance kept adjusting the tuner, his fingertips numb from both the cold and the overwhelming tension. He murmured each band to himself, checking the artillery frequencies usually used during active combat. Suddenly, a faint click sounded in his headphones, a sign that a signal was trying to break through the static. He signaled for silence, leaning in closer, afraid to miss even the smallest important sound. The voice returned so weak it was barely audible, yet enough for him to recognize the same frequency from earlier. The commander stepped closer, eyes fixed on Lance, waiting for an answer that could decide the unit's fate. The artillery voice echoed faintly through the haze, asking once more to confirm the coordinates before firing. Lance tried to respond, but the signal was too weak. His words broke apart and vanished into the static. He tapped the side of the radio, hoping to improve the connection, but the interference remained like an invisible storm. Outside, German shells exploded closer, making the command bunker tremble as dust drifted down. An aide warned that unless they acted immediately, American artillery would fire according to the preset schedule. The commander turned to Lance, voice firm but steady. "You must regain that signal whatever it takes." Lance took a deep breath, adjusted his headphones, and poured all his focus into the faint frequency that had just spoken. He caught a few scattered words, enough to realize the artillery was counting down to fire the first volley. Cold sweat slid down Lance's temple, even though the bunker was far too cold for anyone to sweat naturally. He understood more clearly than ever that missing even a few seconds now would doom the 502nd to friendly fire annihilation. Lance heard fragments like blurred static lost, but together they meant what he feared most. The artillery was preparing to fire. Each broken word chilled him, because if they didn't stop in time, 700 men would be erased instantly. He reported back immediately, but the signal was too weak. His response crushed beneath the thick battlefield interference. The commander looked at him, eyes filled with urgency and desperation, placing the battalion's fate on Lance's ears alone. A burst of German artillery shook the bunker violently, sending dirt from the ceiling falling onto Lance's shoulders. An aide rushed in with grim news. The outer defensive line had lost all contact due to the blizzard and heavy fire. The commander growled, "If we don't reconnect right now, they'll fire directly on us." Lance tried to steady himself, though his palms were numb and the microphone slipped from cold sweat. He pressed the headphones tight again, listening for any trace of the American artillery signal. A faint tone slipped through, too thin to be a voice, but enough to confirm they were on the right frequency. He knew the only way to hear it clearly was to get outside, to higher ground where the terrain blocked less interference. But the only usable height was the observation tower where German snipers had been firing all day. Lance asked himself in silence, "If I don't go, who will save them?" The commander tried to stop him, but Lance replied softly, "There's no other choice, sir." He grabbed the 18-kilogram radio, cables dragging through the snow as German bullets sliced through the air above him. The -20 wind whipped across his face, turning every breath into thick clouds of white vapor. The path to the tower was nearly fully exposed. He ran low, dodging sniper shots echoing from the tree line. A bullet cracked into the wooden beam inches from him, but Lance didn't stop, not even for a heartbeat. He pressed against the tower's steel base, breath shaking, headphones still on as if afraid to lose the signal. The signal returned clearer this time, proof that he was exactly where he needed to be. Lance began climbing, boots slipping on the frozen steel rungs as bullets struck the ladder beneath his feet. He didn't dare look down. He only tightened the straps on the radio, knowing that one slip would end everything. The wind strengthened, stinging his eyes, yet the signal grew sharper with every meter he climbed. Halfway up, Lance heard the words he feared most. Prepare to fire. Awaiting final coordinate confirmation. Panic tried to surge through him, but he forced it down, opened the microphone, and shouted with all his remaining strength. Stop! Wrong coordinates. Do you hear me? That's friendly troops. Repeat, friendly troops. The line fell silent so long and so still that Lance thought the signal had died again. Then the artillery voice returned, doubtful. Authentication code required. Without the code, we cannot halt the volley. Lance closed his eyes for a moment, then answered with remarkable calm. If I were German, I would have let you fire. The artillery crew hesitated, but his logic cut through the static and the first volley was temporarily suspended. Lance steadied himself against the frozen ladder, trying to keep the wavering signal alive as wind hammered against the tower's steel frame. Static roared again, flooding his headphones, forcing him to press them tighter until the faint voice returned beneath the storm of noise. The artillery operator repeated something unclear, the words cutting in and out, as if dragged across shattered glass and broken airwaves. Lance shouted back, fighting the distortion, praying each fragmented syllable reached them before the countdown resumed. A bullet snapped past his shoulder, ricocheting off the tower's metal, but Lance refused to move or loosen his grip. He braced the radio against his chest, the heavy pack shaking with each gust, threatening to pull him off the icy ladder. From below, distant German voices echoed through the forest, signaling a patrol closing in on the base of the tower. Lance knew he had only seconds before either the snipers or the artillery would finish what the cold had already begun. He lifted the microphone again, voice hoarse from the freezing air, trying to push through the blizzard of interference. Do not fire, he repeated, each word sharp, deliberate, fighting to anchor itself inside the collapsing transmission. For a moment, only wind filled his ears, howling through the tower like a warning that time was bleeding away quickly. Then the artillery voice cracked through, demanding confirmation of friendly presence before they aborted the strike entirely. Lance forced himself to speak clearly, despite chattering teeth, painting the exact position of the 502nd in the simplest terms possible. The reply came broken but urgent, asking if he could verify terrain markers around the battalion's frozen defensive line. Lance described everything he could see from the tower. Tree lines, smoke trails, ruined trenches, half buried beneath the snow. Another voice joined the line, distant and skeptical, questioning whether Lance was legitimate or a German impersonator. He answered quietly but firmly, using radio phrasing only American units employed, hoping it would slice through their doubt. The channel erupted with overlapping voices, the artillery crew debating whether to trust a signal distorted almost beyond recognition. Lance tightened his grip on the railing, heart pounding, waiting for the decision that determined whether they lived or died. The wind nearly tore the headphones from his ears as the tower groaned under the relentless cold and distant explosions. Through the storm, he heard them say the countdown was paused, but only temporarily, until verification became absolute. He knew the next step. He needed a stronger signal, something unmistakable, something that proved beyond doubt he was American. So Lance climbed higher, fighting the sway of the tower, searching for a clearer line of transmission above the blizzard. Each rung felt thinner, each breath sharper, as if the cold itself were trying to pry his hands from the steel. Halfway to the top, the frequency cleared for a second, just long enough for Lance to send one final urgent plea. Verify my voice pattern, he said. Compare it to earlier transmissions. You've heard me before. I'm the same operator. Another long pause followed. the kind that swallows entire futures, until someone finally replied, "Stand by. We're checking now." The signal flickered again, clearing for a brief instant, giving Lance a narrow chance to push his message through the storm. He steadied the microphone, forcing every word out slowly, hoping clarity mattered more than volume in the collapsing channel. Far below, distant rifle cracks echoed upward, reminding him that German patrols were moving dangerously close to the tower. Lance pressed closer to the metal frame, trying to shield the radio from the wind that threatened to drown every transmission. Static surged once more, but a faint American voice broke through, asking Lance to confirm the battalion's exact defensive shape. He described the semicircle of foxholes, the broken tree line, and the hastily built snow berms protecting the exhausted paratroopers. The artillery crew hesitated again, weighing his information against their maps, unsure if the distortion was hiding enemy deception. Lance exhaled sharply, breath turning white, insisting the terrain matched their previous reconnaissance from 2 days earlier. A gust of wind nearly tore the radio pack from his shoulder, but Lance grabbed the strap, refusing to let it slip. The tower groaned under the storm's force, swaying subtly, making Lance grip the ladder tightly to avoid losing his position. The artillery voice returned, requesting one final verification: the angle of approaching German armor heard near the 502nd's flank. Lance listened carefully, isolating the distant rumble beneath the wind, identifying the tank engines echoing from the eastern woods. He relayed the information with urgency, confirming that the sound matched German positions previously reported by forward scouts. Silence followed again, a long deliberation, as the artillery crew evaluated whether Lance's signal could still be trusted. Lance clenched the cold metal railing, praying the hesitation meant caution, not preparation, to fire, despite his warnings. Then the voice returned, stating they needed precise distance between the German armor and the paratroopers' defensive line. Lance leaned outward, searching through the snowfall, spotting faint moving shadows beyond the shattered treetops below. He estimated the range quickly, sending the numbers through before the signal fragmented again into harsh, static bursts. The artillery team reacted with alarm, realizing their original coordinates would have hit directly into the 502nd center. They demanded confirmation once more, though the desperation in their tone revealed they already knew he was telling the truth. Lance repeated his report slowly, clearly, fighting the icy air that made his voice tremble as he spoke. Below him, the crack of German rifles grew sharper, bullets slicing through the steel legs of the tower. He ducked instinctively, gripping the ladder, refusing to descend until the artillery fully aborted their fire mission. The signal cleared for a breath, just long enough for Lance to hear someone shouting orders on the artillery line. Another voice entered, this one authoritative, demanding to know whether Lance could authenticate his unit designation verbally. Lance responded with the exact designation and radio call patterns used exclusively by the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment. The channel erupted with confirmation chatter, as operators compared his voice to earlier transmissions logged during the siege. Lance waited, chest tightening, knowing everything now depended on whether those recordings still matched his battered voice. Snow swirled violently, drowning the world in white, as the artillery fell silent once more to finalize their conclusion. Finally, a calm voice returned. "We hear you. We confirm identity. Stand by. We are canceling the strike." The confirmation left Lance trembling with relief, though the wind and cold continued tearing at him as he clung to the frozen tower. For the first time in minutes, the static softened, allowing him to breathe without fear that every second might end in catastrophe. But the danger was far from over. German rifles below kept firing, each shot shaking the metal frame beneath his boots. Lance steadied himself, scanning the forest to judge how close the advancing infantry had come to the base of the tower. He saw moving shadows between the pines, their shapes flickering through snowfall, crawling closer with the unmistakable precision of trained soldiers. The radio crackled again, this time with a different tone, someone from the 502nd asking if Lance was still alive up there. He pressed the microphone, answering with breathless clarity, letting them know the strike was cancelled and they were safe. Cheers erupted faintly through the static, soldiers recognizing what Lance had just prevented, despite the chaos still surrounding them. Yet Lance could not descend. Gunfire below made the ladder a death trap, leaving him suspended between sky and snow. He tightened his grip, bracing against another burst of wind that tugged at his coat and rattled every steel joint of the tower. The paratroopers radioed again, advising him to hold position until they could push back the German patrol beneath the tower. Lance acknowledged, though his voice wavered from exhaustion and cold, each breath scraping painfully against frozen air. Minutes passed, like hours as he waited, listening to the muffled firefight growing heavier near the tree line below. He tried to stay alert, but his body trembled uncontrollably, muscles stiffening from the prolonged exposure to brutal winter winds. Suddenly, the firefight shifted, the Germans redirected their fire upward, bullets smashing into metal just inches from Lance. He pressed himself flat against the tower, clinging desperately while sparks scattered into the storm around him. The 502nd responded immediately, returning fire with fierce determination, shouting orders that echoed faintly through the swirling snow. Below, Lance saw muzzle flashes dancing through the tree line, illuminating chaotic silhouettes locked in deadly combat. He forced himself not to move, knowing even a slight shift on the ice-coated ladder could send him falling. The radio flared again, an urgent voice, shouting that friendly forces were pushing forward and nearing the tower's base. Lance held on tightly, teeth chattering, waiting for the moment when the firing finally began to fade. Footsteps and shouts rose from below, the sounds of Allied soldiers closing in as German forces retreated into the woods. One paratrooper called out to him, their voice cutting through wind. "Lance, hold on, we're right under you." Relief washed over him, but his strength wavered. His legs shook violently from cold and exhaustion accumulated during the climb. They instructed him to descend when ready, warning him to take it slow because the entire structure was coated in dangerous ice. Lance nodded weakly, though they couldn't see him, adjusting his grip as he prepared to make the perilous climb downward. He tested the first rung, feeling it slick beneath his boots, forcing all his remaining strength into each controlled movement. The soldiers below guided him verbally, calling out encouragement as he carefully descended the swaying ladder, step by step. Halfway down, Lance nearly slipped, but he caught himself in time, gripping the steel with numb, barely responsive fingers. At last, boots touched snow. The soldiers rushed forward, catching him before his legs buckled entirely beneath him. The soldiers eased Lance onto the snow, wrapping a blanket around his shoulders as his legs trembled uncontrollably from exhaustion and cold. Though barely conscious, Lance kept asking whether the artillery strike was fully confirmed, cancelled, needing reassurance that the danger had truly passed. One sergeant knelt beside him, gripping his arm firmly, telling him he had saved everyone positioned along the defensive line. Around them, medics rushed between foxholes, tending to frostbite and minor wounds, the aftermath of hours under relentless siege. Lance was lifted carefully onto a stretcher, his radio still strapped to his back, the straps frozen solid from the storm. As they carried him toward the battalion aid post, the snowfall began to ease, revealing the battered tree line beyond their perimeter. Inside a cramped bunker, medics wrapped Lance's hands and feet, trying to restore warmth to skin that had nearly gone numb. He lay silently, listening to muffled voices outside leaders, confirming the battalion's survival thanks to his desperate warning. Several officers gathered near the entrance, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and gratitude as they reviewed the corrected coordinates. One lieutenant pointed at the map, stunned to see how close the artillery strike had been to landing directly on their positions. The commander entered the bunker, stopping beside Lance with a heavy exhale, acknowledging the private's impossible courage under fire. He told Lance that without his decision, the battalion would have been erased before dawn, leaving Bastogne's defense fatally broken. Despite the praise, Lance simply nodded, still processing the fact that a single fading signal had determined hundreds of lives. The soldiers outside continued fortifying positions, stacking ammunition and clearing fields of fire in preparation for another push. Rumors spread quickly through the trenches. stories of Lance climbing an exposed tower during a blizzard to stop friendly fire. Many who passed the bunker door paused to glance inside, hoping to see the man who had changed their fate so sharply. Lance, however, drifted in and out of consciousness, his body finally surrendering after the brutal strain of the 6-minute ordeal. A medic quietly remarked that it was a miracle he had stayed upright on the ice-coated tower for as long as he did. Nearby, the commander dictated a report, documenting every detail, determined that Lance's actions would not be forgotten amid the chaos. He emphasized the precision of the moment, the narrow window in which Lance intercepted the signal and corrected the fatal coordinates. Outside, the wind eased, and a brief calm settled over the trenches as men realized just how close disaster had come. Paratroopers moved quietly, their earlier relief replaced by a solemn awareness that survival often depended on fragile moments like these. Lance stirred weakly, asking whether the battalion still held the line. Someone reassured him they remained strong and unbroken. Though exhausted, he requested an update on German movements, showing the same disciplined focus that defined him even in crisis. A scout entered, reporting that enemy forces had pulled back temporarily, likely confused by the sudden halt in artillery fire. The commander took this as an opportunity to rebuild defenses and redistribute supplies before the next inevitable assault. Inside the bunker, Lance finally allowed himself to rest, drifting into a deep, much-needed sleep while the storm quieted outside. His radio, still humming faintly beside him, seemed like a silent reminder of how close they had come to catastrophe. The men agreed that when the siege lifted, Lance's name would be remembered not as a hero seeking glory, but as one who acted. In the frozen stillness of Bastogne, the battalion prepared for dawn, carrying with them the certainty that one man had saved them all. As dawn approached, the fog began to lift slightly, revealing the battered landscape that had endured another night of unrelenting winter siege. Soldiers emerged from their foxholes, stretching stiff limbs, their breaths rising in pale clouds beneath the faint morning light. The quiet felt unnatural. After days of constant shelling and gunfire, silence carried its own unsettling weight across the snow. A medic checked on Lance again, noting that his pulse had steadied, though his exhaustion ran deeper than any surface wound. Nearby, troops cleaned their weapons, brushing away ice that formed overnight, preparing for whatever the next hours would bring. One soldier whispered that Lance's climb would be remembered long after the siege, a story passed between foxholes for years. Another remarked that fate had been unusually narrow, the battalion surviving simply because one man refused to stay silent. The commander stepped outside, surveying the defensive perimeter, tracing the same lines Lance had saved from destruction. He paused momentarily, realizing how vulnerable they had been and how close the artillery strike had come to erasing them all. Frost clung to every weapon, helmet, and sandbag, transforming the battlefield into a frozen maze of shimmering steel and snow. The men began redistributing ammunition, each cartridge precious, knowing supply lines remained cut and resupply nearly impossible. A radio operator in another bunker tried raising headquarters again, but the signal remained faint, distorted by distance and storm. Despite the static, a few words breached through, telling them to hold. Reinforcements were still fighting desperately to reach Bastogne. The message strengthened morale, reminding them they were not isolated completely. Someone out there was pushing toward them. Back in the aid post, Lance stirred awake, eyes opening weakly as he recognized the familiar rumble of distant tank engines. He asked immediately whether the Germans were advancing again, his instincts still sharp despite the overwhelming fatigue. A medic reassured him softly, explaining the sound came from friendly armor moving somewhere far beyond their current position. Lance exhaled slowly, relief mixing with lingering tension, the memory of the near disaster still vivid in his mind. The commander entered moments later, placing a hand gently on Lance's shoulder, thanking him once more for his extraordinary courage. He emphasized that the battalion owed their survival not to chance, but to a private who refused to let fear steal his voice. Outside, the men huddled around makeshift fires, warming hands and sharing quiet words about what the day might bring. No one spoke loudly. The weight of the night lingered, settling into their bones as they prepared for the next ordeal. Every soldier knew the Germans would not stay silent for long. Another assault could arrive with the next shift of wind. Yet hope flickered. They had survived the impossible, thanks to a man whose bravery had changed the fate of the entire line. Lance listened to the murmurs outside, realizing slowly that the battalion viewed him not as a quiet operator, but as a lifeline. He tried sitting up, but the medic urged him to rest, warning that pushing himself too soon could undo their efforts. Nevertheless, Lance insisted on being updated, wanting to remain aware of every movement along their frozen perimeter. The commander responded steadily, explaining new defensive adjustments made in direct response to Lance's timely information. Hearing this, Lance felt something unfamiliar, a quiet pride building beneath the exhaustion, knowing his actions truly mattered. As morning fully broke over Bastogne, the battalion stood ready once more, strengthened by the resolve of a single determined soldier. As the sun edged higher, the sky shifted from gray to pale silver, casting a faint glow across the battered defensive line. The men moved slowly, adjusting gear and clearing snow, each motion revealing the fatigue that had settled deep into their bones. Despite exhaustion, determination tightened their posture. They knew Bastogne still needed every ounce of strength they had left. Inside the bunker, Lance regained a bit of clarity, noticing the subtle calm that had replaced the chaos of the previous night. A soldier quietly approached him, offering a canteen and thanking him with a sincerity that carried more weight than words. Lance nodded humbly, still trying to process that a single decision he almost doubted had saved hundreds of men. Outside, the sound of distant artillery echoed faintly, this time far from their position, signaling shifting battles beyond Bastogne. The commander reviewed plans again, reinforcing what Lance had identified. Information, even fragile, could alter the course of survival. Paratroopers gathered briefly, sharing quiet conversations about what might have happened had Lance not acted when he did. Some spoke of loved ones back home, acknowledging that they would see them again because one man refused to hesitate. As hours passed, sunlight revealed the full devastation around them, the shattered trees, broken trenches, and frozen earth. Yet amidst the destruction, there was unmistakable resilience. The battalion stood united, their morale strengthened by the narrow escape. Lance slowly sat up, encouraged by medics, trying to breathe steadily despite the cold that still clung to his lungs. He listened as soldiers outside prepared for another difficult day, their resolve hardened by understanding the cost of hesitation. A young paratrooper peeked in, offering Lance his extra gloves, insisting he deserved better than the frozen pair he wore. Lance accepted quietly, touched by the gesture, realizing his story was already spreading through the tight-knit ranks. The commander returned, informing him new orders were coming, and Bastogne's defense depended on every capable man. Though drained, Lance insisted he could return to duty soon, unwilling to rest while others bore the weight of the siege. The commander placed a firm hand on his shoulder, reminding him that survival was not weakness, it was a victory. Outside, a small patrol moved out to scout German positions, careful, alert, stepping through deep snow with practiced silence. Lance watched them leave, feeling a renewed sense of connection to the men whose lives had depended on his judgment. The battlefield no longer felt like a distant responsibility. It had become something he carried within him now. Medics checked him once more, confirming he could stand, though they warned him not to push himself too quickly. Lance stepped outside slowly, greeted by frigid air and silent nods from soldiers who now viewed him differently. He saw the line of foxholes stretching across the frost-covered ridge, realizing how fragile life had been just hours earlier. The thought settled heavily. Courage was not loud, not dramatic. It was the quiet choice to act when no one else could. As the wind swept across the snow, Lance understood that the memory of this night would outlast the war itself. These men would remember what happened here, not because of medals or reports, but because their lives continued forward. In the end, survival became the greatest testament to the strength of one soldier who refused to let fear dictate fate. And so, amid the frozen silence of Bastogne, Lance's 6-minute decision lived on proof that even the quietest voice can save a battalion. Don't forget to hit subscribe to discover more untold stories of World War II.